I never thought something as simple as a family dinner could turn into this much of a headache. But here we are. My name is Mark, and my wife Julia is hands down one of the best cooks I know. She loves trying out new recipes, experimenting with flavors, and honestly, her food could easily belong in a high-end restaurant. It's one of the things I love most about her, how much joy she gets from cooking and sharing her meals with the people she cares about. We host family dinners pretty often. It's a way to stay connected, especially with our busy schedules. My parents always appreciate a home-cooked meal, and for the most part, everyone enjoys these gatherings, except for my brother, David, and his two kids, Emily and Lucas. David is a great brother, and I love my niece and nephew, but when it comes to food, they are on another level of picky. I'm not talking about just disliking vegetables or avoiding certain flavors. I mean full-on refusing to eat anything that isn't part of their extremely limited list of approved foods. Plain pasta with butter, chicken nuggets, grilled cheese. Those are their go-to options. Anything outside of that, forget it. At first, Julia tried to accommodate them. She made kid-friendly meals, toned down seasonings, and even attempted to replicate some of their favorite foods from scratch. It didn't matter. They would take one look at the food, scrunch up their faces, and push their plates away. David never seemed too concerned about it. His response was always the same. They're just kids. They'll grow out of it. But meanwhile, Julia was spending hours cooking, only to watch 2 plates go untouched. I could tell it bothered her. Not because she wanted praise, but because she put effort into making something enjoyable for everyone, and it felt like a waste. It had happened so many times that I started dreading our family dinners, and I knew something had to change. I get that kids can be picky, I really do. But Emily and Lucas take it to a whole different level. It's not just that they prefer simple foods, it's that they refuse to eat anything else no matter what. And when I say refuse, I mean full-on rejection. No trying a bite, no giving it a chance. If it's not one of their handful of safe foods, it's not happening. Julia once made homemade mac and cheese thinking it was a safe bet. She used mild cheese, kept the seasoning simple, and even made sure the texture was creamy and familiar. Emily took one look at it and said, "It's not the box kind." Lucas just pushed his plate away without a word. That was the whole response. It didn't matter that it was essentially the same dish, just better quality. If it wasn't the exact brand they were used to, they weren't touching it. Another time, Julia made chicken tenders from scratch. Light seasoning, crispy breading, everything a kid should like. But they only eat the frozen kind from the store. Again, untouched. The worst part is that it's not even about allergies or dietary restrictions. It's pure stubbornness. And David, he never corrects them, he just shrugs it off, acting like it's completely normal for kids to be this rigid with food. After a while, Julia stopped trying. She still made an effort to include basic, kid-friendly options on the table, but she wasn't going to waste time making entire separate meals. And honestly, I couldn't blame her. Still, every time we invited them over, the routine was the same. The kids wouldn't eat. David would make a passive comment and they'd grab fast food on the way home. It was getting old. At first, we tried to brush it off. We figured maybe it was just a phase or that eventually they'd warm up to trying new things. But dinner after dinner, it was the same pattern. Julia would cook, taking extra care to include at least one simple dish the kids might eat. The rest of us would sit down, compliment the meal, enjoy our time together, except for David and his kids. The moment the plates were set in front of them, it was like watching a bad rerun. Emily and Lucas would glance at their food, exchange a look, and then refuse to eat. David never made a big deal about it. Instead, he'd just chuckle and say, "Guess we'll have to stop somewhere on the way home." It was always said casually, like it was no big deal. But it was. Julia never said much about it, but I could tell it bothered her. She'd spend hours planning and preparing, only to watch 2 plates go untouched. It wasn't about the validation, it was about respect. She never expected the kids to love everything she made, but a simple attempt, a tiny bite, that didn't seem like too much to ask. The worst part was that it wasn't just the kids. David's attitude was what really set me off. He never once encouraged them to try the food or even thanked Julia for cooking. He acted like it was our responsibility to cater to his children's impossible standards. There was one night in particular that stuck with me. Julia had made a beautiful roast with mashed potatoes and roasted carrots. Simple, flavorful, nothing too complicated. The second Emily sat down, she wrinkled her nose and went, "Ew, what's that smell?" Julia just gave her a tight smile and kept serving, but I could see it in her face. She was hurt, and I was getting tired of watching her go through this over and over again. That's when I started thinking, maybe the next dinner needed to be different. I had already been frustrated with how these dinners were going, but that night, Emily's comment pushed it over the edge. Julia had just finished setting the table when Emily walked in, sniffed the air and scrunched up her nose. "Ew, what's that smell?" she asked, loud enough for everyone to hear. The room went silent for a second. I saw Julia freeze for just a moment before she forced a polite smile and kept setting down plates. My parents exchanged an uncomfortable glance, but no one said anything. David didn't even react. He just kept scrolling through his phone like he hadn't heard a thing. I expected him to correct her, to at least remind her to be polite. Instead, he acted like it was normal, like it was okay for his daughter to insult the food that someone had spent hours making. That stung. Julia never said a word about it, but I could tell she was hurt. After everyone left that night, she was quieter than usual while cleaning up. I tried to brush it off, but it stuck with me. This wasn't just about picky eating anymore. This was about basic respect. I knew kids could be blunt, but they were old enough to understand manners. They were old enough to know that if someone cooks for you, you at least acknowledge the effort. I didn't say anything to David that night, but the whole situation sat with me for days. It wasn't just frustrating anymore, it felt disrespectful, and that's when I decided I wasn't going to let it slide again. Next time, I was going to set a boundary. After that night, I kept replaying everything in my head. The untouched plates, the lack of gratitude, Emily's rude comment, all of it. I wasn't mad at the kids, they were just doing what they had always done. What really got to me was David. He never once told them to be polite, never once thanked Julia for cooking. He just let it happen, as if we were the ones being unreasonable for expecting basic manners. Julia never brought it up, but I knew it bothered her. And honestly, it bothered me too. So when we planned our next family dinner, I decided to handle things differently. Before sending out the invite, I called David. "Hey," I said, keeping my tone casual. "We're having dinner this Saturday. You guys are welcome to come, but listen, if Emily and Lucas aren't going to eat, maybe just feed them beforehand." There was a pause. "What?" David finally said, like he couldn't believe what he'd just heard. "I mean, they never eat what Julia makes anyway," I continued. "And I know they're picky, so maybe it'd just be easier if they had something at home first. That way they won't be hungry, and we won't have to deal with them refusing dinner again." I expected him to understand. I thought he might even appreciate the compromise. Instead, he got defensive. "So you're saying my kids aren't welcome at your house unless they eat what you serve?" His tone was sharp now, like I had just insulted his entire family. "That's not what I said," I replied, trying to stay calm. "I'm just saying we're not running a short-order kitchen. Julia puts a lot of effort into these meals, and it's frustrating when they won't even try anything." David scoffed. "Wow, real nice, Mark." And just like that, the conversation went downhill. I could already tell from his tone that this wasn't going to end well. "You know they're kids, right?" David said, his voice laced with irritation. "You can't force them to eat something they don't like." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my patience. "I'm not forcing them to do anything, David. I'm just saying that if they're going to refuse everything anyway, maybe it makes more sense for them to eat beforehand. That way no one has to feel awkward, and Julia doesn't have to waste her time cooking food that's just going to be ignored." David let out a short laugh, the kind that told me he thought I was being ridiculous. "Or, and hear me out, you guys could just make something they'll eat. It's not that hard. A box of mac and cheese, some nuggets, problem solved." I clenched my jaw. "That's not the point." "It kind of is," he shot back. "You're acting like this is some huge burden, when all you have to do is put some plain pasta on the stove. But no, everything has to be your way." His words hit a nerve. "Julia isn't running a restaurant, David," I said, my voice firmer now. "She spends hours cooking for these dinners, and it's really disheartening to see her effort dismissed over and over again. We're not asking for much, just a little appreciation, or at the very least, some basic manners. David went quiet for a second. Then he sighed. You're seriously making this a thing, huh? I could feel the conversation slipping further away from any kind of resolution. Look, I said, trying one last time. We want you guys here, but this situation isn't fair to Julia. If they won't eat, that's fine, but just feed them first so we're not stuck in this same cycle every time. David exhaled sharply. Yeah, well, maybe we just won't come at all then. And before I could say anything else, he hung up. I stared at my phone for a moment, still holding it in my hand even after the call had ended. I wasn't sure what I expected, but I hadn't thought David would outright refuse to come. Julia walked into the room, drying her hands on a kitchen towel. Everything okay? I sighed, rubbing the back of my neck. David's not coming, he's mad about what I said. She hesitated, then shrugged. Honestly, maybe that's for the best. I wanted to agree, but I knew this wasn't over. And I was right, because the next morning, my mom called. Mark, she started, her tone already carrying that familiar weight of disapproval. What's this I hear about you telling David not to bring the kids to dinner? I let out a slow breath. That's not what happened, Mom. I just told him that if the kids aren't going to eat, maybe it'd be easier if they ate beforehand. She clicked her tongue. You know how David is. He's sensitive about this stuff. You could have just made something simple for them. I clenched my jaw. Mom, we have. Every time. Julia has tried making food just for them, and they still refuse. At some point, we have to stop bending over backward. I just don't see why it had to turn into this, she said, sighing. You know how stubborn he is. Couldn't you have just let it go? I pinched the bridge of my nose, frustration building. So Julia should just keep making meals that get ignored, while David acts like we're the ones being unreasonable? She was quiet for a moment. Then she sighed again. I just don't want there to be tension in the family over something like this. Neither did I. But I also wasn't sure if I was the one who had made it worse. After the call with my mum, I sat in silence for a while, replaying everything in my head. Maybe I could have handled it differently. Maybe I had been too blunt. Julia must have noticed something was off because she sat down next to me, nudging my arm gently. What's on your mind? I exhaled. David. My mom. The whole situation. I don't know. Maybe I should have just let it go. She tilted her head, studying me. Do you actually think you were wrong? Or do you just feel guilty because they're making you feel like you were? That was a good question. I glanced at her, noticing the way she was holding herself, calm, but with that same tired look she always got after these dinners. How do you feel about it? I asked. She hesitated for just a second before saying, Honestly, I feel relieved that they're not coming. It's exhausting, Mark. I love cooking, but spending hours in the kitchen just to watch my food go to waste over and over again? It's frustrating. And it hurts. That last part hit me the hardest. Julia never complained, never made a big deal out of it. But the truth was, this whole thing had been weighing on her more than she let on. I reached for her hand, squeezing it. I just didn't want to upset everyone. She gave me a small smile. I get that, but I also think you had every right to say something. I mean, if David had just told his kids to be polite, we wouldn't even be having this conversation. She had a point. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe I should have just made some nuggets and avoided this whole mess. Even after talking to Julia, the doubt wouldn't go away. I kept replaying the conversation with David, my mom's disappointment, the tension that now existed where there hadn't been any before. I had set a boundary. I had stood up for Julia. But had I made things worse in the process? I tried to see it from their side. To David, it probably felt like I was being inflexible, like I was making dinner more about a principle than about family. To my mum, it looked like I was the one creating conflict, when I could have just taken the easy route and made a separate meal for the kids. But then I thought about Julia. How many times had she gone out of her way to accommodate them, only to be met with rejection? How many times had she smiled through the frustration, acting like it didn't bother her? Was it really fair to keep expecting her to do that? I wasn't saying the kids had to eat everything on their plates. I wasn't demanding that they suddenly love every meal. All I had asked was that they eat before coming over, so we could avoid the same cycle of wasted food and passive-aggressive comments. Was that so unreasonable? I wasn't sure anymore. At the same time, a part of me wondered if I had let my frustration build up too much before saying something. Maybe if I had approached it differently, if I had talked to David in person instead of over the phone, it wouldn't have turned into such a big deal. Now, instead of a simple dinner, we had a family rift, and I had no idea how to fix it. I found myself stuck between two thoughts. Was I right to stand up for Julia? Or had I made something small into something bigger than it needed to be? And more than anything, was I the one who had turned this into a problem? So now here I am, laying it all out for you. I didn't think asking my brother to feed his kids beforehand would turn into such a big deal. In my mind, it was a fair compromise. If they weren't going to eat what we made, why go through the same exhausting cycle? But now my brother isn't talking to me. My mom thinks I was out of line, and I'm stuck wondering if I could have handled it better. I keep going back and forth in my head. On one hand, I feel like I was just setting a boundary. Julia has spent so much time cooking for these dinners, only to have her food completely ignored. It's frustrating, it's discouraging, and it's honestly a little insulting. I don't think it's unreasonable to ask for some level of respect when someone is putting in effort to host you. On the other hand, was it really that big of a deal to just make nuggets? Would it have been so hard to boil some plain pasta? I hate the idea of running a short-order kitchen, but at the end of the day, was it worth the argument? And then there's David's reaction. I still don't think I said anything offensive, but maybe I could have handled it differently. Maybe if I had framed it more as a suggestion instead of a request, he wouldn't have taken it so personally. And my mom, was she right? Was I making something out of nothing? Or was she just saying that because she didn't want family drama? That's why I'm putting this out there, because at this point I don't know if I was being reasonable or just being stubborn. So tell me, was I the jerk here? Should I have just made a separate meal for the kids and avoided all of this? Or was I right to finally say something? I'll let you decide.